Subcommittee will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. We welcome everyone to today's hearing on the weaponization of the ATF. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Dakota to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank the gentleman from North Dakota. Without objection, the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, will be permitted to participate in today's hearing for the purposes of introducing a witness, which we will get to in just a few minutes. The chair now recognizes himself for an opening statement. In June 2021, just a few months after taking office, President Biden directed the Justice Department to adopt a zero-tolerance policy to revoke federal firearms licenses from those who committed, quote, willful violations of the law. That same month, ATF updated its internal best practices guide to state, quote, ATF will, absent extraordinary circumstances, initiate proceedings to revoke the license of any dealer that has committed a willful regulatory violation of the Gun Control Act for specified violations, close quote. These willful violations now include purposefully broad classifications like, quote, falsifying documents and failing to maintain records needed for successful firearms tracing, and would essentially allow the ATF to revoke the licenses of FFLs for simple technical and non-material paperwork violations. And ATF is zealously doing just that. The year after the zero-tolerance policy went into effect, ATF revoked over 90 licenses, more than any year since 2006. Last year, that number jumped to 157 FFL revocations. The year before zero tolerance went into effect, there were just 40 revocations. To be sure, the Gun Control Act authorizes the ATF to inspect FFLs to ensure they are compliant with record-keeping requirements and all other applicable laws and regulations. But that is so the government can ensure that there are no illegal firearms transfers occurring, not for revoking licenses for simple paperwork violations. We've talked to some of the affected FFLs. We've even talked to some who beat the ATF in court and were able to keep their license. They told us it cost over $150,000 in fees to keep their license. There's no way the average small business can afford that much in legal and consulting fees, and ATF knows this. And the data shows this brazen scheme is working. The number of voluntary business closures post-inspection has risen sharply from 24 in 2021 to 69 in 2022 and to 80 last year. This is exactly what the left wants. Democrats and Joe Biden have been trying to take guns away from Americans for years. If they can't take the FFLs away, they are going to limit the number. If they can't take the guns away, they're going to limit the number of places where law-abiding Americans can go purchase their firearms. Today, we'll examine the actions by ATF that led to the untimely and unnecessary death of Brian Malinowski. At this time, I want to offer my condolences to the members of Mr. Malinowski's family. Some of them are here with us today. We're also joined by Congressman Hill, who I mentioned earlier, who represents Mr. Malinowski's and his family and has sought justice on their behalf. In the early morning hours of March 19, 2024, armed ATF agents arrived at the Malinowski family home in at least 10 vehicles to execute a search warrant. According to the warrant, the ATF alleged that Mr. Malinowski was selling firearms without a license. Footage from the Malinowski's doorbell camera shows ATF agents approaching the house with riot shields and subsequently disabling the camera to prevent their conduct from being recorded. Upon hearing the commotion and fearful of a home intrusion, Mr. Malinowski awoke and prepared to defend his family. Mr. Malinowski encountered what he and his wife believed to be home intruders. An exchange of gunfire ensued. Mr. Malinowski was shot in the head, and he died from his wounds 2 days later. The circumstances of Mr. Malinowski's death raised questions about whether the ATF followed proper protocol during the execution of this search warrant. DOJ policy and President Biden's executive order 14074 requires ATF agents, including those who conducted the search warrant on the Malinowski family home, to wear active body-worn cameras during the execution of that warrant. The department, however, has since confirmed to the Malinowski family that ATF agents were not wearing body cameras during the raid, a clear violation of the department policy. It is also unclear whether ATF agents complied with Justice Department policy on no-knock entries. In explaining the rationale for this policy, Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco noted that, quote, because of the risk posed to both law enforcement and civilians during the execution of no-knock warrants, it is important that this authority be exercised in only the most compelling circumstances. Furthermore, Ms. Monaco directed the use of no-knock entries should be restricted to instances in which an agent has reasonable grounds to believe that at the time of the warrant, that the warrant is sought, that knocking and announcing the agent's presence would create an imminent threat of physical violence to the agent or to another person. It's not clear if the raid was a no-knock encounter because, in part, the ATF agents disabled the Malinowski's home camera. ATF is yet to explain why it resorted to a risky pre-dawn entry of Mr. Malinowski's home when it could have peacefully executed the warrant while he was away from his residence. I think that's a huge question. But the ATF wanted Mr. Malinowski to be home when they executed the search warrant. We know ATF abandoned a previous attempt to execute the search warrant when they learned Mr. Malinowski wasn't home. They were actually primed and ready to go the week before, but didn't go because he wasn't there. Why did they need him to be in the home, as this was a search warrant and not an arrest warrant? In fact, there were numerous other less dangerous options available to the ATF. The ATF knew his pattern of life. They could have chosen to wait for Mr. Malinowski to leave for work and safely approached him after he had exited his home. The ATF could have conducted the raid after Mr. Malinowski left for work and had other agents meet him at his work where he was not allowed to carry a firearm. The ATF could have waited until he was gone and asked Mrs. Malinowski to call him back after the house was secure. ATF agents could have given Mr. Malinowski more time to answer the door during the knock and announce so he knew it was the police. Since the ATF chose to ignore their own policy, not wear body cameras, we will never know if they gave him the 10 seconds or 60 seconds or whatever to answer the door. And tomorrow, in front of the full Judiciary Committee, Director Dettelbach will have a chance to explain the actions of the ATF. But today we look forward to hearing from our witnesses. I want to thank them all for being here, and I now yield back and now recognize the ranking member for an opening statement.
Thank you to the chairman. Good morning, and thank you to the witnesses and the others that are here and joining us at this hearing. Last week, after Trump insider and convicted criminal Steve Bannon demanded that Chairman Jordan do more to protect Donald Trump, and this committee answered the call. It's no accident that last week, this committee called as witness a former defense attorney for Donald Trump in the classified documents case. Rudy Giuliani's former lawyer and the attorney who has written and filed Chairman Jordan's amicus briefs to the Supreme Court to support Donald Trump's many indictments. Republicans rolled their eyes and snickered when I noted, as the ranking Democrat on the subcommittee, that the plain goal of that hearing was to influence the New York hush money trial against Donald Trump. Just so the public is clear how closely this committee is trying to link Donald J. Trump's criminal and civil matters and use this committee to act as outside defense special counsel, 2 days ago, Robert Costello, a Republican witness from last week's hearing, was called by Donald Trump as a witness for the defense in that very trial and used his same manic, rambling testimony that he gave in this subcommittee. Thankfully now, maybe the chairman and GOP members won't continue to be blasted by Fox News and other MAGA news outlets and blogs for not doing enough with the committee to support the former president. Costello got to try out his testimony. Defense counsel thought it was good enough to appear as a witness on the stand last week. I know the American people don't believe that this is an appropriate use of the $20 million allocated to this committee. Holding 6 full hearings to bolster disproven lies that the government is colluding with social media companies to target conservatives, calling in an anti-Semitic, anti-vax, racist conspiracy theorist who claims a worm ate part of his brain as a witness. Others just spread the widely debunked fringe claims about the deep state or have personnel grievances from appropriate firing from their former employers that the committee offers them time to air here. This is what Republicans have made of the committee process, but I guess it goes along with their inability to effectively legislate in this Congress as well. You know, people often wonder, with my courtroom litigation background, having been a prosecuting assistant district attorney, if I enjoy these hearings. I have to tell you, every time I get a notice of a hearing for this committee, my stomach hurts because I'm disturbed by the use of this legislative time to prop up a failed individual. One individual. A loser in elections, a disastrous dictatorial wannabe in governing, a perennially bankrupt, false revenue inflating con artist in business, and a cheater in marriage even. That's who the Republicans want us to spend our time on, supporting Donald Trump, rather than the American people. Today, we're going a step further. We are somehow having a hearing to protect the gun lobby, to prop up Donald Trump's pro-death agenda, when more than 100 Americans die of gun violence every day. We have colleagues who have lost friends, classmates, mass shooters. Some of us in this Congress see the scourge of illegal guns coming across state and city lines to ravage communities with gun violence and death of youth. But these deaths happens everywhere, haunting every corner of the American experience, and without a robust federal law enforcement and ATF and FBI, Americans will die at a faster rate. I know that the Virgin Islands, my home, our federal law enforcement play a critical role in combating the scourge of drugs and guns, trafficking. Without these agencies, or with more guns available to bad people, my region where I live and all of America will be even more dangerous. Families of gun violence victims have their lives ripped apart and turned upside down in a moment. None of that is helped or made less common occurrence when we attack and undermine the ATF and the FBI. Republicans on this committee simply, it's not a matter of caring about those mass victims. Families in Uvalde identified their children by shoes because they could not identify them by the faces that they had looked at every day. It's easy to become desensitized in politics, but if that doesn't hurt you, if you don't feel anything for that, God help us all. There have already been 27 deaths from school shootings this year alone. Almost 4,000 children and teens are shot and killed every year, 15,000 more injured. Guns are the #1 cause of death in children between the age of 1 and 18. The first cause of death, guns. Not car accidents, suffocation, drowning, poisoning, cancer. #1, guns. An entirely preventable death if guns were in fact well regulated. Instead of addressing this real problem, and instead of listening to 3/4 of gun owners, 3/4 that support common sense gun safety laws, we're continuing with this. They brought us here right after Police Week in furtherance of a mission to defund and dismantle the agency trying to save our children, save Americans from gun violence. The ATF is a central agency dedicated to stopping the source of gun violence. Its agents ensure the background check laws are followed. They keep guns out of the hands of criminals. They investigate gun crimes. They prevent mass shootings, school shootings. They support local law enforcement and gun tracing and enforcement efforts. They do the vital work we so desperately need. We're going to hear today about ATF overreach, and especially about the death of Mr. Malinowski. That is a tragic loss of life. Every loss of life is tragic. Our sympathies, all of us, I believe, go out to the family. While an investigation is ongoing it's inappropriate to be drawing conclusions before the results of an investigation are released. We do know from affidavits from the court that it was alleged that Mr. Malinowski was a mass gun trafficker, and we know that some of the guns he sold were used to commit crimes. We know that ATF agents were serving a legitimate search warrant. Beyond that, we await the results of an investigation, and this committee shouldn't seek to influence that. Let's not be mistaken. Republicans are not here today because they're concerned about the tragic loss of life during a police raid. You know why I know that? Because they have not uttered a word about a Florida deputy shooting and killing Senior Airman Roger Fortsman in his apartment just a week ago. You know why I know that? Because they don't say anything. They don't say the name Breonna Taylor, who in 2020 was shot and killed in her home through an inappropriate police raid. They don't want to talk about the gun violence impacting communities or how across the country, a Black American is shot and wounded every 11 minutes. They don't want to talk about the interstate gun trafficking that's fueling violence in Illinois, where on an average someone is killed every 6 hours with a gun, and where Black individuals are 38 times more likely than white individuals to die by gun homicide, triple the national average. So while homicides dropped by 13% in Chicago last year, that doesn't mean that people aren't still dying. Those victims deserve to be more than statistics. We don't talk about that. They don't want to talk about that. They don't want to talk about other kinds of police raids. They want to talk about this police raid on Mr. Malinowski because it fits their narrative about how to dismantle the ATF. That's what this is about. Don't let them fool you. They don't care. And when they do care, it's not about every American. It's only about a specific type of American that they're concerned about those deaths. Because I don't hear those other names being called by them. Ms. Sampson, Mr. Graham, I want to thank our witnesses for being there today. Ms. Sampson, your expertise and vast experience in gun violence prevention space is truly impressive. I'm confident it will be invaluable as we examine those issues here today. Mr. Graham, I'd also like to thank you for your more than 37 years of public service at the ATF. I guess I will be enlightened as to why you've begun getting paid by the very gun lobby fighting ATF's work. I want to thank the other witnesses. I would ask all four of you today in your testimony answers to remember something. As we engage in this hearing, in the 3 or so hours we'll be sitting here before us, more than a dozen Americans will lose their lives to gun violence. It's a somber but necessary reminder of the gravity of what we discuss here today and what's really at stake. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back without objection. All of the opening statements will be included in the record. I will now recognize the gentleman from Arkansas to introduce one of our witnesses.
I thank the chairman, thank the ranking member for the invitation today to appear before the committee to introduce my constituent, my friend, Bud Cummins. Bud Cummins is a prominent Central Arkansas attorney. He's a former U.S. attorney and former counsel to former Governor Mike Huckabee. He's joined today, Mr. Chairman, by the widow of Brian Malinowski, mayor, and we're glad to have her here to be witness to this event today. Mr. Cummins is representing the Malinowski family who are still seeking answers from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives after ATF agents raided their family home in the early hours of March 19th. This pre-dawn raid resulted in a deadly shootout in which ATF agents shot and ultimately fatally wounded Brian Malinowski, as I said, a friend and constituent of mine, in his own home. And Mayor Malinowski is a widow at the hands of gun violence by her own government. Nobody knows more about this case than Bud Cummins. I'm glad he's here to answer the committee's questions and help get answers for the family and the American public. Thank you, Chairman Jordan, for your leadership in holding this hearing, and I hope through your efforts we can obtain well-deserved answers to what led to the tragic death of Brian Malinowski. Brian's widow, family, and the public deserve a full accounting from the ATF. I thank the chairman and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I thank you for your work in bringing this terrible situation to our attention. Thank you very much. We also have Mr. Andrew Graham. Mr. Graham is the founder and CEO of Graham Industry Advisors, a veteran-owned consulting firm that advises the firearms industry on compliance with the Gun Control Act and the Safe Explosives Act. He previously served as the ATF Deputy Assistant Director of Field Operations and Deputy Assistant Director of Enforcement Programs and Services. Mr. Ryan Kleckner is an attorney who specializes in federal firearms law and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives Compliance. He previously served our country in the U.S. Army, where he was a ranger and sniper instructor assigned to the 1st Ranger Battalion. We thank you for that service as well. Ms. Kelly Simpson is the Director of Racial Justice and a Senior Counsel at Brady. Her work focuses on racial justice and reducing gun violence. We welcome our witnesses and thank them for appearing today. We will begin by swearing you in. Would you please rise and raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Let the record show that each of the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Please be seated. Please know that your written testimony will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, we ask that you summarize your testimony. We will start with Mr. Kleckner, and we will move right down the aisle. So, Mr. Kleckner, you're recognized for 5 minutes, more or less.
Good morning, Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Plaskett, and the members of the subcommittee. I'm Ryan Kleckner. I'm an attorney specializing in federal firearms law and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives Compliance. I am actively involved in the firearms industry, and I help federal firearms licenses, or FFLs, to stay compliant with federal laws and ATF rules and regulations, either through online training at Rocket FFL, or most recently through free ATF compliant software I made at FFL Safe. I'm also a former firearms industry executive, a university lecturer, and a special operations sniper. I'm here today because I am concerned with what I see as the overreach of the ATF when it comes to their enforcement actions over FFLs and the current administration's zero tolerance policy when it comes to licensee inspections. The Gun Control Act of 1968 is the main body of law concerning standard firearms and the federal firearms licensing system. And specifically, the GCA allows the ATF to revoke an FFL's license for a willful violation of the law. Originally, the GCA had no such willfulness standard, but Congress, in 1986, amended the GCA to specifically include the willfulness requirement to, quote, ensure that licenses are not revoked for inadvertent errors or technical mistakes. The Senate notes on that matter referenced Rich v. U.S., where the ATF was required to reissue a license absent a showing of a willful violation, because willful at that time was found to mean purposeful, intentional behavior. Now, the addition of willful that standard by Congress is significant because an FFL's compliance obligations are largely clerical and technical in nature, and in some instances, a mere typo could be considered a violation of the Gun Control Act. By requiring willfulness, Congress clearly raised the standard for revocation to only include situations by which a licensee purposefully and intentionally violates the law. The administration's current zero tolerance policy flies in the face of Congress's intent, and it's causing harm to otherwise law-abiding FFLs, and it's wasting ATF's limited resources. I have a client, Point Blank Firearms, an FFL in Michigan, that is a perfect example of the harm caused by the zero tolerance policy and overreach by the ATF. The ATF is currently trying to revoke their license based on an inspection that started in July 26th of last year. And on April of this year, the acting director of industry operations for the Detroit Field Division provided my client with a notice of revocation. We elected to have a hearing on the matter and have yet to be provided with a date. And my clients, the owners of Point Blank, are here with me now while their employees are back home unsure about their jobs. And one of the owners, a first-generation Arab American, also owns a second FFL business with another partner who's being denied his due process because they have to have their inspection on hold until this inspection is finalized. In this matter, the ATF falsely claimed that my client had 308 missing firearm transaction forms. In reality, my client has 0 missing forms. Every single one's been located, matches the FBI background check numbers, and bears the customer's signature. The ATF also falsely claimed that they made errors by transferring firearms more than 30 days after the background check. That also is completely untrue. Those are provably transferred the exact same day the background check happened. Now, to be fair, the ATF inspectors weren't aware of the facts during the inspection. However, when we presented all this information and facts to the ATF and asked them to reconsider this revocation, they denied that and are pushing forward. I'm going to share a few facts about my client that are relevant to understand what type of FFL the ATF is spending all this time, energy, and money trying to shut down. In over the 12,000 firearms acquired by Point Blank, Not a single firearm has ever been lost or stolen. Point Blank has 100% accountability of the 4473s, over 11,000 of them. Point Blank has never transferred a firearm to someone who failed a background check. They've never failed to make, submit, or keep a multiple sales report. And not once in the approximately 300 ATF trace requests have they failed to give timely and accurate information. In summary, Point Blank has never engaged in any activity, even accidentally, that would have any negative impact on public safety. They take their role very seriously. I think ATF's zero tolerance policy is severely misguided and it's wasting ATF's limited resources. And this overzealous policy is harming the ATF's relationship with retailers. ATF should focus its resources on trigger pullers on the street and not shutting down honest, hardworking, and law-abiding gun stores. Thanks for the opportunity to speak today. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kleckner. Mr. Graham, you're recognized for 5 minutes. hit that microphone if you could, Mr. Graham, so everyone can hear you.
Thank you, Chairman.
Go right ahead.
Good morning again, Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Plaskett, and distinguished members of the Select Subcommittee. My name's Andrew Graham, and I appreciate the opportunity today to appear before you and testify about an issue which has impacted my career as a former ATF employee, as well as that one that truly hits home. For 37 years, I proudly served in the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and I am a veteran of the United States Air Force, National Guard. As a Deputy Assistant Director, I served in the capacity over ATF's regulatory enforcement, as well as Deputy Assistant Director over their enforcement program services, that is tracing, etc. During this time, I worked alongside some of the most talented men and women that I've known, who've done a yeoman's work in providing safer communities and enforcing the laws and regulations to uphold the Constitution. I developed strong relationships with our agents, our field investigators, better known as IOIs, as well as directors of industry operations of all 25 field divisions. Some may find it surprising that the agents and the IOIs develop rapport with FFLs, or better known as retailers, but that relationship is critical as FFLs are often the first line of defense in keeping firearms out of the hands of prohibited people. They share tips with ATF and suspected traffickers and/or potential straw purchasers. I can tell you from personal experience now as a consultant that members of the firearms industry do not want firearms to go into the wrong hands. And I put a lot of emphasis on that. That is a standing, do not want firearms to be in the hands of prohibited persons. In fact, the firearms industry is one of the most heavily regulated industries where firearm retailers spend countless hours ensuring that they're up to speed on current laws and regulations. But FFLs are human, and the best of the retailers, they do make mistakes. That was part of my job for 37 years, is identifying these errors, working to help that they aren't repeated, ensure that the proper training was deployed, and to provide an opportunity for an FFL to get back on track. In the summer of 2021, President Biden announced a comprehensive strategy to prevent and respond to gun crimes and ensure public safety, which included directing the ATF to revoke federal firearm dealers under a zero-tolerance policy if they violate the law, willfully violate on the following counts. 1, transferring a firearm to a prohibited person. 2, failing to run a background check. 3, falsifying records such as transaction forms. Those are the ATF Form 4473s. Failing to respond to a trace request within 24 hours. And lastly, refusing to permit ATF to conduct an on-site inspection during normal business hours. Revocation, in a sense, is the loss of a federal firearms license and closes the business entirely. So this is a big deal. It's not just the loss of a license, but it's the loss of one's livelihood. As stated by ATF in 2014 when detailing the federal firearms revocation process, willfulness is not defined by the regulation, but is defined by case law to mean the intentional disregard of a known legal duty or plain indifference of a licensee's legal obligation. In the case of an FFL who has willfully violated the law, has shown an intentional disregard for the legal requirements, or has knowingly participated in criminal activity, revocation may be the only viable option. The problem is the breadth of the zero-tolerance policy is much larger than just the rogue gun dealers. It was initially that was supposedly carried out to address, with willful violations being redefined on a case-by-case basis. With the numerous enforcement complexities, it strained the relationship between the regulator and the industry. This is putting FFLs who should never have been caught up in this new policy and damage the cooperative trust built between the agency as well as industry members. It's become so rampant that FFLs facing revocations that never would have faced them now are pressured into shutting down their businesses and depleting funds that they, quite frankly, don't have. In December of 2022, I made the tough decision to retire from civil service, and in my time since leaving ATF, I have continued to do what I have enjoyed while I was there with ATF, working with members of the firearms industry to ensure regulatory compliance. And in the event that FFLs aren't snared in this new policy, I help them to navigate the process to help preserve their livelihood and their law-abiding businesses. Thank you for your time. I look forward to answering your questions as well.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. Ms. Sampson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Plaskett, and distinguished members of the Select Subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. I'm Kelly Sampson, Senior Counsel and Director of Racial Justice at Brady, the oldest national gun violence organization in America. Gun violence is a public health epidemic, causing more than 44,000 deaths each year. 44,000 deaths, and many more who live with injury and trauma. Since 2020, gun violence has been the top cause of death for American children and teens, which is why thousands of kids and their parents plead for Congress to protect them. Despite our country's love of freedom, gun violence is the reason why many Americans no longer feel free to go to school, a July 4th parade, the movies, concerts, the grocery store, and places of worship. Gun violence is why many of your own constituents, gun owners and non-gun owners alike, are desperate for you and your colleagues to pass common sense gun laws and ensure those laws are properly implemented. With tens of thousands dead and many more injured, Congress should be focused on ending our gun violence epidemic and equipping the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or ATF, to meet its mandate and to enforce the nation's gun laws. Just days ago, Congress celebrated Police Week, where members gave countless speeches in support of law enforcement. ATF is not only law enforcement in and of itself, but also a critical ally of state and local law enforcement agencies across the country. ATF is the only federal law enforcement agency which has specific jurisdiction over firearms and gun industry oversight. It should also be noted that guns are the leading cause of death for police officers killed in the line of duty. But guns don't grow on trees. Almost all firearms are sourced from the legal market, manufactured, imported, distributed, and sold by federal firearms licensees, or FFLs. Generally, manufacturers and importers sell to distributors who sell to dealers who then sell to the public. Dealers are the first line of defense against gun trafficking, and most take this responsibility very seriously. In fact, the large majority of gun dealers won't sell a single crime gun in a given year. But a small number of dealers' negligent practices filter guns directly into the criminal market. According to the last available data, nearly 70% of crime guns were traced back to just over 1% of licensed dealers. So even though the portion of the gun industry most responsible for supplying crime guns is minuscule, ATF nonetheless struggles to meet its mandate. ATF only has the resources to inspect about 8% of active FFLs annually, falling far short of its own internal goal of inspecting each FFL every 3 years. To reach that goal, ATF would need to more than double its current compliance staff. In fact, over 2,000 active gun dealers have gone more than a decade without inspection. ATF struggles to meet its mandates because it's been under-resourced and deprived of a confirmed director for decades. Indeed, just this year, Congress voted to once again reduce ATF's budget, despite the gun violence epidemic. These obstructions erode ATF's oversight capacity, forcing hard-working law enforcement agents to regulate a behemoth industry with their arms tied behind their backs. And undermining ATF doesn't just hinder the agency, but it also harms local law enforcement across the country. ATF plays an essential role in supporting state and local law enforcement nationwide, including in your districts. When an incident of gun violence occurs, ATF helps local and state law enforcement partners by generating investigative leads and information on guns recovered in crimes, by tracing them to their last known retail purchaser. ATF also trains officers to better understand and advance firearms technology. These services strengthen state and local law enforcement, providing them with information, coordination, and education necessary to enforce existing laws and prevent future gun crimes. Congress must listen to their constituents and recognize that the American people are begging for gun violence prevention policies. Americans, gun owners and non-gun owners, want to be safe. Federal oversight for the firearm industry does not hinder any law-abiding citizen's Second Amendment right. Instead of attacking ATF, you should be building up the agency and supporting its efforts to end gun violence. In the shadow of Police Week, we must remember that ATF agents are law enforcement too, and they play an important role in protecting the public and other law enforcement officers all over the country from gun violence. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Sampson. Mr. Cummings, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Plaskin, and thank you, Representative French Hill, for the introduction. Representative Hill has been very engaged and concerned about the death of Brian Malinowski and his district, and we really appreciate his help bringing attention to this tragedy. My name is Bud Cummins. I'm an attorney for Brian Malinowski's family, and I'm a former United States attorney from the Eastern District of Arkansas. I want to tell you a little bit, Mr. Chairman, about Brian Malinowski. Until 2 months ago, Brian was the executive director of the Bill and Hillary Clinton National Airport in Little Rock. He was 53 years old. He and his wife, who's present with us today, Mare, celebrated their 25th anniversary last December, and he had many good friends. He grew up in Pennsylvania with his brother and his two sisters, and he wanted to be a fighter pilot, but he didn't have the eyesight. So instead, he went and got his became a certified flight instructor, got a college degree, and went into the airport management industry. And he had several stops along the way in Pennsylvania, Florida, but in El Paso, Texas, is where he met his wife, Mare, and as I said, they've been married 25 years. He found his way to Little Rock and eventually was named the executive director of our airport. By all accounts, he's very good in his profession. Our airport is one of, I think, 9, I've heard a few different numbers, less than 12 in the country that's debt-free. And that, I think, may be a concept that's strange here in Congress, but I think that represents some good management. Brian was also a lifelong collector. As a child, he started collecting coins. He had various hobbies. He was that guy. I've been to their home and seen books this thick about coin collecting currencies, and about card playing. He studies card playing, and he tried his hand at competitive card tournaments. About 6 years ago, Brian's father gave him his gun collection, and that sparked a collection interest in Brian. And since then, he has become also a gun collector. And he found at gun shows, he found other people who shared his enthusiasm and his interest in not only guns, but in coins and other artifacts that you'll find at a gun show. He'd set up a table on weekends occasionally, and he'd display some of his guns, and he'd display his coins, and he would buy and sell and trade with other collectors. It is legal to buy and sell and trade firearms without a federal firearms license if you are a collector or a hobbyist. At some point, ATF suspected that Brian Malinowski may have crossed a very murky line, and he was no longer a hobbyist. Because of that, ATF concluded that he was required to buy a $200 FFL, federal firearms license, before he sold any more guns. One thing is certain: his family and his friends and all his work colleagues would all guarantee you, if they were here today, that he loved his career and he loved being in the airport management business. And if anybody had ever suggested to him that his weekend hobby was in any way threatening that, he would have immediately been hands off. But nobody told him. Instead, ATF launched a criminal investigation into Brian. They researched his background. They put a tracker on his car. They put tails on him and surveilled him. And soon they obtained a search warrant to search his home. By the time they obtained the warrant, they knew a lot about Brian. They knew he worked in a secure environment at the airport. They knew he had lived a law-abiding life with absolutely no criminal history. And they knew he lived at home with his wife and his 2 dogs, and they kept a very regular schedule. Despite all this knowledge, ATF hatched a plan to execute the warrant by force. And on March 19th at 6:01 a.m., over 1 hour before sunup, 10 carloads of ATF agents and Little Rock Police Department officers came to the Malinowski home to execute the search warrant. They wore full tactical SWAT gear, and they approached the door at 6:02 and 46 seconds a.m. That's an hour, over an hour, about an hour and 15 minutes before sunup that day. They had a piece of tape ready, and they covered up his doorbell camera. So if he had time to wonder who was at the door, I think people get a doorbell camera to see who's at the front door, but they took away his ability to do that. Moments later, Mrs. Malinowski heard a loud crash as their front door caved in, and fearing for his wife's safety, Brian jumped up at the sound of a crash, found a pistol, loaded a magazine in it, and left the bedroom to investigate. He warned his wife to stay behind him in the bedroom, but she stubbornly followed him through the doorway. It appears to us that ATF also killed the electricity to the home, making it difficult for Brian to see in the pre-dawn hours. Mrs. Malinowski saw only darkness as she peered down towards the front entryway and could see shadowy outlines of presumed home invaders standing in her front hallway. That's what Brian saw too. There was gunfire and Brian was fatally wounded. His wife was standing just a few inches from him when he received a fatal wound to his head. We don't know all the details of what happened at the front door because they covered up the Ring camera and because they didn't wear body cameras in spite of a 3-year-old policy initiated by the President of the United States that mandated that they wear body cameras when executing search warrants. But we do know this. We know 57 seconds elapsed from the time they covered up the lens of the camera to the time Mr. Malinowski was dead. So something less than 57 seconds is the time it took them to knock, if they knocked, but we don't know if they knocked, force entry on the front door, and for Mr. Malinowski to emerge, to wake up, find a gun, and come to the bedroom. That means they couldn't have been at the front door more than 20 or 30 seconds. Although her husband had just been shot in the forehead right in front of her, the agents dragged Mrs. Malinowski into the front yard. She was barefoot, wearing minimal night clothing, and the temperature was 32 degrees. They locked her in the back seat of a car where she was detained for 4 or 5 hours. She begged to be allowed to check on her husband, but they refused those requests and kept her locked in the car in her nightgown. And she also had not been to the restroom yet since she'd just gotten out of bed, and they refused her request to go to the neighbors and use the restroom. And then finally, it took her to a nearby fire station, made her walk through in her night clothes in front of the firemen and use the restroom with a female police officer present in the room while she went to the restroom. Mrs. Malinowski does not have the answers to many of her questions, and there are a lot of questions. We give federal law enforcement awesome powers. We have given, and when I was United States Attorney, I was responsible for the use of those powers. But it's a huge problem if those powers fall into the wrong hands. I've been involved in public controversy for many years. I've never been involved in anything that more Kansans have come to me to express their concern. And they all ask the same question, why? And I don't have an answer for that. We don't have an answer to that question, and we hope this committee will pursue this and find the answer, why? And if there's not an answer, we hope that you'll find the problem and fix it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cummings. That was well said, and so wrong. Gentleman we will now proceed with a 5-minute question. Gentleman from North Dakota is recognized for 5 minutes.
Early morning hours, riot shields, probably a no-knock warrant, but either way, a full-on Tommy tactical assault on a residential dwelling. Mr. Cummings, you said it in your opening statement, but where did Mr. Malinowski work?
He was the executive director over the Little Rock Airport.
Do you know if firearms are permitted at the Hillary Clinton National Airport?
To my knowledge, it's like every other airport. They do not allow you to carry firearms in the airport.
To your knowledge, had Mr. Malinowski ever been accused of bringing firearms to work?
Not to my knowledge. I'm not aware of him being accused of any misconduct at his job.
Would it stand to reason that if Mr. Malinowski had been driving into work or driving home from work, he would not have brought a gun with him, given that it's a gun-free zone?
I think that's a fair assumption.
Do you think that in the process of executing their search warrant, they would have, the FBI or the ATF would have been able to get a copy of Mr. Malinowski's work schedule?
I think his work schedule was well known to the ATF.
And I want to be clear, I mean, because we're talking ATF and because we're talking firearms and we're doing all those things, this is basically a licensing dispute.
Yes, sir, and it's a alleged violation that the definition is subjective, and it's been actually litigated quite a bit here recently, and it's become apparent that it's almost every person in this room could read it and come up with a different interpretation.
Mr. Graham, during your tenure at the ATF, were you ever involved in planning and execution of search warrants?
Congressman, I have not.
Okay. Mr. Cummings, is your time as at the U.S. Attorney, did you have a chance to review search warrants?
Yes, sir.
When do you use no-knock warrants? Well, let me stop. What's the most dangerous kind of warrant to execute?
A no-knock warrant when you kick the door and wake people up out of their beds when they may have a gun nearby.
When's the worst time to execute them?
Probably at 6 a.m.
And if you're in charge as a U.S. Attorney or ATF supervisor or any of those things, what's your number one concern when determining whether or not to execute a no-knock warrant?
Safety of the officer and safety of the public.
Was there anything, you talked earlier about tracking devices, and can you go through a little bit of this, of what they were doing prior to the night the warrant was issued?
They had followed Mr. Malinowski around town and surveilled him on numerous occasions. They ran agents in to do undercover buys at gun shows. They'd taken pictures of him at the gun show. It's breathtaking, the amount of resources for an agency that claims budgetary constraints, that they put this many resources on a gun show case.
I can think of 500 different ways in which this warrant could have been executed to protect the law enforcement officer and protect the victim in this case. I don't know what else you call them. What is the stated reason for executing the no-knock warrant?
I think in case law, you would look for exigent circumstances. They might be risk of escape, they might be destruction of evidence, they might be danger to some other party that's in the house. Of all the exigent circumstances I'm aware of that have ever been discussed in any case, none of them existed here, and that was well known.
Likelihood of the evidence being, I mean,
you can flush drugs.
Yeah, all of the difference, utilized a lot in drug cases. They know somebody had delivered at midnight. They know it's getting farmed out the next day. So with all of this information and all of the things you know about the case, have they stated any exigent circumstance for utilizing the no-knock or utilizing this type of enforcement of the warrant?
To my knowledge, DOJ has released the affidavit that supported the search warrant and has called me and Senator Tom Cotton to tell us that there was no body cameras used that day, and that's the only statement they've made about this case.
I mean, I think we need to just take a step back here and recognize if this was anything else other than ATF and firearms, people would be apoplectic about how this warrant was set up. But because it involves something that has a political reason, but there's a person dead. Somebody's dead because the ATF decided to execute a warrant in the most unprofessional, irresponsible, and dangerous way. And I think that oftentimes law enforcement have a very difficult job. The number one concern is the safety of the officer. But the reality of this is this was executed for reasons that make no procedural sense. They make no safety sense, and somebody is dead because they decided they wanted to go into a house at 1 a.m. of a known gun owner for the purpose of making, I can think of anything else other than a political statement. Thank you for representing the family. Thank you for being here today. The ATF has a history of doing these things with warrants, and it has to stop. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent motion.
Gentleman's recognized. Gentleman yields back. Gentleman's recognized.
I'd like to introduce the search warrant affidavit and search warrant, which is not a no-knock warrant.
Was it still at 1 a.m. with, I don't know how many people in 6 a.m. in Tommy tactical gear?
Without objection, the chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm repulsed to hear my colleagues' calls to destroy the one agency that actually provides for firearm safety. I vividly recall the tragic events that unfolded on February 14th, 2018 at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, in my home county. That day, our nation witnessed one of the deadliest school shootings in American history, where 17 innocent lives were brutally taken and countless others irrevocably changed. The horror of it still resonates across our community. In case my Republican colleagues forgot, these victims were students and educators with dreams and aspirations snuffed out by an AR-15, which is a battlefield rifle. One was Alyssa Al-Hadaf, a 14-year-old soccer star. Another, Scott Bagel, a teacher who died protecting his students. My colleagues will and are citing what they claim are injustices today, but none of them will mention Scott or Alyssa's name, nor will they mention the tens of thousands of others just like them who are shot and die from firearms each year. My colleagues also won't share how Stoneman Douglas students huddled in classes or sent tearful, desperate texts to loved ones, or how every school parent was knotted in panic awaiting news about whether their child was alive or dead that day. But my colleagues are not here to talk about those real-life but grim gun realities. They want to bury those realities and ignore the fact that the U.S. gun homicide rate is 26 times that of other high-income countries. Instead, they brought us here to do the bidding of the gun lobby, and for that, they should be ashamed of themselves. Ms. Sampson, I want us to clear up the ridiculous assertion that gun dealers' licenses are revoked over minor clerical errors or typos. Isn't it true that clerical errors can often be serious problems that cause guns to fall into a criminal's hands, and that a typo could be an attempt to falsify business records?
That is true, and as you noted, when discussing the zero tolerance policy, there are 5 enumerated actions that will qualify, and it would be something like falsifying a record, which you cannot do accidentally. You can't, by a typo, falsify a record. It has to be a willful and deliberate violation.
Like, for example, it could include not running a background check on a purchaser when legally required to, or include selling that firearm to a violent felon, correct?
Correct.
Is it fair to say, then, that clerical errors includes very dangerous situations where firearm dealers shirk their duties and sell guns to criminals?
That's not only true, but they're not clerical errors when you look at what they actually are. These are deliberate and willful wrongdoings.
One such group of criminals that I'm concerned about getting their hands on guns are domestic abusers. Every month, an average of 70 women are shot and killed by an intimate partner. That's more than 2 per day in the United States. Yet today we sit here so gun lobby lackeys can try to block background checks that would prevent these abusers from getting guns in the first place. We're here so Republicans can protect gun traffickers who skirt the rules and let guns fall into criminal hands. To pretend that non-compliant dealers are the victims, and we are losing thousands of our mothers, sisters, and daughters to abusers who get their hands on guns, sure seems like that's why we're really here. Ms. Sampson, how much more is an abused woman likely to die if her male abuser has a gun?
The exact statistic just left my mind, but I believe it's 4 times as likely.
I think it's 5 times,
5 times as
actually.
likely, yes.
And why is that?
It's because having a firearm in that situation makes it more likely for it to escalate quickly. And contrary to some of the statements around it being an equalizer for women, even if a woman has a firearm, she can quickly be disarmed and that gun can be turned against her.
Right, and yet I've heard my Republican colleagues say that the solution to this is for women to have guns too. Tell me, Ms. Sampson, does a woman having a gun in the home make her safer against an intimate partner?
Absolutely not.
In general, isn't it true that adding more guns to a violent situation actually increases fatality rates?
That's correct.
Before I yield back, I want to make it clear that we have far too many loopholes in our system. For example, my Jamie's Law legislation, named for Fred Guttenberg's daughter who was murdered at Parkland, would prohibit anyone from purchasing ammunition who is already barred from buying a gun. It's a common sense layer of protection, but federal law doesn't require a background check to prevent prohibited purchasers from acquiring ammunition. Jamie's Law closes this ammo loophole. Why do we need it? Nearly 40,000 people die from guns in the U.S. every year. That's 4 people every hour whose dreams are snatched away by a gun and a bullet, each one leaving a trail of sorrow and pain for friends and family to navigate over an entire lifetime. Now, it's only elected Republicans that are chained to the gun lobby, and Republicans are really good at saying that we don't need more laws, we just need to enforce the ones that are already on the books. Well, it's already illegal for prohibited purchasers to purchase ammunition, but we don't enforce it. So I think that all of my colleagues, I would expect, would join me in co-sponsoring Jamie's law, bringing it to the floor immediately so that we can actually enforce a law already on the books instead of adding a new one. Thank you. Practice what you preach. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Cummings, what was Brian Malinowski's principal livelihood?
He was the highest paid city employee in the city of Little Rock as the executive director of the Little Rock Airport, and it's a matter of public record, I think he made about $260,000 a year.
So it wasn't selling guns?
No, sir, this was
And the rule at the
collecting guns
time,
was a
the
hobby.
law at the time says if your principal livelihood is not in selling firearms, you do not need an FFL. Is that accurate?
That's my understanding to the best you can have
So
an
what
understanding.
what was the crime? What did he do wrong?
You'd have to ask ATF. They decided that maybe had committed a crime even though.
Now, the standard is changed, but the new rule didn't take effect until this past Monday. Is that right?
That's correct.
And even under the new standard, there's a question of whether he was in violation of the law. Is that accurate?
A huge question.
Huge question. But under the old standard, it was pretty simple. Is your principal livelihood selling firearms?
That's correct.
And for Brian Malinowski, it wasn't.
Obviously not.
It wasn't. And yet, at 6:02 on March 19th, 10 cars pull up to his home and to the gentlelady behind you's home, come up to the door in tactical gear and put a tape across the doorbell camera so no one can see what's going to go on.
Correct.
Now, that's scary to me.
Ought to be
Now,
scary to
if the guy had done, if he had for sure done something wrong, a crime, okay. But they do that, and then 57 seconds later, gunshots erupt, and Brian Malinowski is no longer with us. A good man, you knew the guy, served your community, highest paid city official in Little Rock. What the heck do you think's going on here?
That's the question on the lips of every person in Arkansas that's contacted me, and that's a large number of people.
And isn't it true that a week before, these same agents were there in the Walmart parking lot close by the Malinowski home, going to go execute the search warrant, and then decided not to because Brian Malinowski wasn't home? Why was it so critical that he be home?
I don't know, Mr. Chairman. It was a search warrant. In fact, they could have waited till nobody was home and come in. If they wanted to kick the door down, they could have come at noon and kicked the door down when Mayor and Brian were both gone.
And searched and found
Searched
whatever
till-
they were looking for.
Exactly.
And anything they wanted on Mr. Malinowski, if they wanted his phone or anything, they could have served that warrant. They could have got a warrant for that. I'm sure the judge would have given it to him, and they could have done that at the airport.
Correct.
At his principal livelihood at the airport, correct?
Correct.
Then to add insult to injury. This is the part that just, I know, infuriates Mr. Hill as your member of Congress, and I would bet any American, to add insult to injury, the way they treated his spouse, Mrs. Malinowski, sitting behind you, the way they treated her at a moment that maybe the most high anxiety moment in any individual's life, their spouse has just been shot, that to me is like unbelievable. What she had to go through.
It makes me very angry.
Well, it should. It should make all of us angry. I think it makes a Democrat. There's no explanation for that. That to me, and I keep coming back to, was this done for some kind of intimidation? We've seen this from other agencies, frankly. Intimidation. We had the FBI, Mr. Houck, come in, arrest him in front of his wife and children. Same thing. Pre-dawn raid, 7 kids there, take him away. When his attorney said, we'll be happy to work with you. You'd have been happy to work with these guys if they had contacted you or any.
Absolutely.
That's the part that gets us. That's the part that gets. What was his principal livelihood? It was not selling firearms. I can't figure out what the crime is. Now, by the way, any of the firearms that Mr. Malinowski sold as part of his hobby, any of them ever be used? Were any of them ever used in a crime?
The affidavit alleges that they were found in crimes, but the crimes were 3 traffic stops where there was marijuana and a firearm in the car, so that was a crime. Yeah. And
but the
2 other ones, but they were never fired in the commission of a crime.
Guns themselves were never used in a crime.
They were never used in the commission of a crime, according to the affidavit.
Yeah. So you asked it in your testimony. You said the right thing. Why? Why did they do it? I mean, why did this happen this way? That's what we're going to try to find out. Tomorrow, Mr. Dettelbach will be sitting right where you guys are sitting, and we're going to ask him questions about this. He's probably going to say ongoing investigation, but we're going to push him as hard as we can to try to figure out why they would behave in this way and why they didn't wear body cams. I mean, it's almost like, what are they trying to hide? Cover up the doorbell, no body cams? What are they trying to hide? But we'll get to those questions tomorrow. With that, I see my time has expired. I will now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as a member of the House Oversight Committee, I strongly supported the independent investigations years ago of operations conducted by the ATF, and that included Operation Fast and Furious and Operation Wide Receiver by the Department of Justice. I also believe that under the circumstances surrounding the death of Mr. Malinowski, we should also institute a full and independent review. However, like Ms. Sampson, I do not agree with the ad hominem attacks on our ATF agents and law enforcement personnel. I was here in 2002 when President George W. Bush, reestablished the ATF within the Department of Justice, and he did that for all the right reasons, I believe. You know, we had a mission to protect communities from violent criminals, criminal organizations, and also we needed to get at the problem of the illegal use and trafficking of firearms. To this end, the ATF regularly, to my experience, works with local and state law enforcement agencies nationwide to reduce gun violence, a national crisis that's affected each of our communities. In my own district, which includes part of the city of Boston, the ATF Boston Field Division recently partnered with the Boston Police Department, the Suffolk County Sheriff's Office, the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, and the U.S. Attorney's Office on a new initiative to combat the flow of illegal guns and the incidence of violent crimes using those guns. In particular, the Boston Firearm Intelligence Review Shooting and Trafficking Program, or the Boston First program, was developed to deploy state-of-the-art shot spotter technology, or ballistics tracking technology is another term, to assist law enforcement agency in reviewing shooting incidents and firearms trace data to take illegal guns and violent criminals off the street, and also to respond more quickly to those incidents of gun violence. The ATF Boston Field Division also participates in several critical multi-agency task forces within our state and our city. Perfect example of what that collaboration can do is, you know, we had a shootout at my local park. So I grew up in the housing projects. We got a park across the street. It's heavily used, the second most heavily used park in the city. And we had a shootout between two rival gangs. And it was during a couple of lacrosse games, a lacrosse tournament, and a basketball tournament. And it ended up in a situation where moms and dads had to lay on top of the bodies of their kids to prevent them from being shot. There were only 60 shots fired. It only lasted a couple of minutes, but that couple of minutes felt like a couple of hours to those parents trying to protect their kids. So we were able to, with the help of the ATF and Boston Police, the FBI, the DEA, who I asked to get involved as well, and also police departments from Boston, City of Brockton, Quincy, Stoughton, to begin to attack that problem and bring in some of that technology to reduce the likelihood of that happening again. And I'm very thankful. I'm thankful for my ATF agents and law enforcement personnel for the job that they do. It's not easy. But Ms. Sampson, if you could talk a little bit about, you know, last week we had, you wouldn't believe it, but we had law enforcement officers National Police Week, where we show appreciation. Now we're going after them. Could you further discuss the extent to which ATF supports local law enforcement in preventing gun violence and gun trafficking?
Thank you. So there are a variety of forms that this takes. First, we have to think about the context that we're in, which is epidemic gun violence. So we have over 44,000 people killed each year, and that doesn't account for all the shootings that happen where people are injured or where there's just shots fired. So local law enforcement agencies are trying to respond in that environment. And ATF is the only federal agency that can help them understand, number one, where are the guns coming from? They can't figure that out without ATF. So every time a gun incident happens, ATF is the one who tells them where the gun came from, which can help them identify suspects and follow those leads along. ATF also helps law enforcement understand firearms technology so that they can better understand what's going on in their communities. And then in terms of preventing gun violence in the first place, because gun violence is the #1 cause of death for police officers, ATF's work around regulating the industry and preventing guns from being trafficked into communities stops gun violence before it starts, which is a huge help to local law enforcement.
I think the gentlelady, I'm
Mr.
sorry.
Chairman,
I'm sorry.
just so you know, the previous witness had like 8 minutes. And so, you know, you could
I
extend the courtesy.
would ask unanimous consent, the gentlelady have an additional minute. I was not trying to short, I gave her an
I don't think
extra
you were here.
35 seconds.
I don't think you were here,
after you
Mr.
said-
Chairman, but thank you.
If you could wrap up in 1 minute, please.
Sorry. Yeah, so I mean, to just put a finer point on it, local law enforcement agencies could not do their work without ATF.
Thank you for your courtesy, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Always. I might recall the time the gentleman and I were in the outback of Pakistan, and the gentleman was hurt in a sniper fire. So we go back a long way on gun safety. And the gentleman is correct that we do need the alcohol, tobacco, and fire. We definitely do need ATF. Mr. Graham, thank you for your decades of service. You obviously stayed there because of your dedication to the very mission that we're talking about today of making sure that guns are not in the hands of people who are not entitled to have them or may misuse it. Is that correct?
That's correct, Chairman.
And so in that dedication, in 37 years, you've seen some zigs and zags. Can you talk about what you've seen or saw that might have changed in the last few years that concerns you?
Certainly, from a field investigator perspective, all the way through the first and second level of supervision, I've personally conducted field inspections to where errors were disclosed on 4473. That is the transaction record that individuals buy or complete when they buy firearms through a federal firearms licensee. What concerns me is with the zero tolerance policy, ATF has had a long-standing administrative action policy that did address licensees' level of compliance or their level of violations in compliance with the Code of Federal Regulation. And through the inspections, they were given an opportunity, those violations that weren't directly linked to public safety, those were corrected.
So let me just interrupt you briefly. So what you're saying is that in the past, your job was to get maximum compliance, knowing that mistakes are made, but that changed in 2021, didn't it?
Most certainly, it put a lot of focus where there was minimal latitude allowed with the zero tolerance policy. However, there was the exception of presenting extraordinary circumstances. However, those were to be discussed during a held hearing at the various division levels.
Is that necessary? In other words, prior to 2021, do you believe that compliance with the clear threat of both the cost that comes with going to court and the possibility of losing that valuable license was sufficient to get of the vast majority of people to make every effort to comply?
Providing that the violations, Chairman, did not have a direct nexus to criminal activity, the FFLs were provided an opportunity to remediate. Basically, it's the investigator's job to ensure that the records that are executed are fully compliant simply because it's those records that criminal enforcement uses to trace a firearm to the last known legal possessor. And if those records are inaccurate, it could perhaps affect how a warrant is served, who the individual is that may be perhaps looked at. So prior to 2021, there were opportunities using the Administrative Action Program to address violations that were found at a federal firearms licensee, given their previous inspection history considered in the entire process.
So let me just give a couple of quick questions, and you may not be the only one that wants to answer it, but certainly during the Obama administration, Operation Fast and Furious went counter to everything you normally did, allowing more than 2,000 weapons to end up in the cartel's hands. That was a deviation from any sensible thing that you saw during most of your 37 years. That was, quite frankly, not what happened during the next 4 years after President Obama. The question is should your agency be able to operate substantially the same without regard to who happens to be in the White House? And should your mission be more consistent and, in fact, looking at what happened with Fast and Furious, what happened in the Obama administration as an attack on guns, and particularly on their ability to collect money, which was a separate program, versus the 4 years of President Trump and the 8 years of President Bush before that, and now President Biden. Do you see kind of a back and forth that reeks, in general, of politics rather than you're being able to do your job in a consistent way? And you can comment on any of these administrations you feel appropriate.
Quite frankly, Chairman, I have no comment to make on Fast and Furious. That was a criminal enforcement endeavor. As far as the regulatory perspective is concerned, you have both ATF agents and industry operation investigators that are dedicated to upholding the United States Code of, as well as the Code of Federal Regulations. When there are changes, it not only affects how the investigators deploy their on-site inspections, compliance inspections of a federal firearms licensee, but on the industry member themselves. There is a lot of back and forth, there's a lot of confusion, and going back to the zero tolerance policy did create confusion as to, last year or a few years prior, I may have been inspected. However, I wasn't cited for whatever that Code of Federal Regulations citation was. But however, this year during a CURT inspection, because of this new directive, they are being pursued for revocation.
Okay, I'm on just a yes or no from anyone, hopefully everyone, very quickly. In what happened that the chairman was talking about a few minutes ago, should this committee seek to mandate body cams anytime potential lethal force is being used in any ATF operation? Yes or no?
Yes.
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 Thank you. That was a yes, ma'am? Yes. I got 4 yeses. I'll take it. We now go to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly. That is hard to get, but I will take yes for an answer. Mr. Connolly.
And I say yes, too, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cummins, I just want to clarify something in your testimony. You heard my colleague from New York enter into the record the actual warrant, which was not a no-knock warrant. Is it still your testimony that what occurred, the tragedy that occurred with Mr. Malinowski and his family, was a no-knock warrant?
Because body cameras weren't worn and the doorbell camera was covered up, we don't know what happened at the front door. But I would say, based on what we do know, that 57 seconds I described, minus the time to allow for Mr. Malinowski to respond to the crash in the door, and whatever time it took them to knock on the door, if they knocked after they covered up the door, we know that it was 20 or 30 seconds.
But
and my answer is it's a distinction without a difference.
Well,
if all you
okay.
hear is a crash,
All right, but for the record,
what do you know?
but for the record, you're a lawyer.
Yeah,
The warrant filed was not a no-knock warrant.
not on its face.
That's right.
Sir.
Thank you. Just want to clarify that. Ms. Sampson, Mr. Cummins described really a horror that should not occur to any American citizen or American resident. Is there, however, a distinction in the solution? The solution before us today is abolish the agency because they engaged in behavior that was brutal or violent or beyond acceptable norms. Do you believe that's the solution?
Absolutely not.
So the very same people who condemned those who called for that solution with the Minneapolis Police Department after the George Floyd tragedy, have a different solution today for ATF. For some reason, this particular police force ought to be abolished and no other, even if they also engage in violent behavior, brutality, and violation of the law. Do you note the irony?
I do, and with respect to the ongoing investigation, that's not what my area of expertise is. We, of course, believe in accountability because we live in a democracy. So there should be accountability and investigation.
Right, but the solution isn't to abolish the agency.
Exactly.
In fact, the agency has some very important missions, as Chairman Issa just indicated. He said, no, we need ATF. I agree with him. Reform it, yes. Abolish it, very different kind of answer. What would happen if we abolish the ATF? What kinds of consequences might flow from that?
There will be consequences for all Americans. First and foremost, we would lose the only federal agency responsible for making sure that firearms are not trafficked into our streets.
Maybe that's why some people don't like the ATF, that particular charge, that they don't want regulation of arms of any kind, and they don't like the federal agency that has that mission, which may be why for so many years they've blocked the confirmation of an ATF director.
That could be. All I know is that ATF is the only federal agency that we have, and we're dealing with epidemic gun violence.
Well, let's look at that. So if we abolish it, would that make it easier for criminal cartels to traffic firearms in this country?
Yes.
If we abolish it, would that, in fact, strengthen Mexican cartels engaged in human trafficking, drug trafficking, and arms trafficking?
Yes.
Would we expect more assault weapons to be funneled to the black market if some of my colleagues succeeded in abolishing the ATF?
Yes.
Could it affect violent crime in the United States?
Absolutely.
How so?
Well, ATF right now, as I said, they are responsible for regulating the industry. And so we know that almost every gun starts out in the legal market, and it's funneled from the legal market, which are FFLs who are regulated by ATF, into the illegal market. So if ATF is no longer there, then that channel, which is already larger than it should be, would overwhelmingly increase, and we would have more guns and more gun violence.
So if we abolish ATF, as the chairman of this select committee, not Mr. Issa, want to do, and that is supported by an agency that gave him an A+ rating, Gun Owners of America, that actually sells merchandise calling for abolish the ATF. If we did that, it's your testimony, I don't want to put words in your mouth, that it would actually make Americans less safe and would remove the only federal agency charged with trying to protect them from firearm violence and trafficking in America.
Yes, that is true.
Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Klegner, what is the ATF's zero tolerance policy?
It is a change in how they used to enforce violations of the law against FFLs to no longer allow them to fix errors or to improve their compliance. It has no tolerance for these typos and wants to revoke their licenses.
And give me a flavor of the type of errors that might have previously resulted in the ATF working with a license holder and now would result in the agency trying to revoke that license.
I'd love to give you the examples that fly in the face of what the zero tolerance policy says it is, which is prohibited persons and background checks and things like that. But the problem is my client did none of those things that are even stated in the zero tolerance policy, and they're still falling subject to getting revoked. We can talk about a typo of an abbreviation of somebody's name when they shouldn't have done that. We can talk about accidentally listing United States as the country instead of paying attention to the box saying county, things like that.
Well, Ms. Sampson gave testimony that these are essential, that these are necessary regulations to enforce at the finest point. Do you have a response to that testimony?
Some are essential, I agree. The background check requirements, the identification requirements, and making sure we know who the purchaser is, and they're not a prohibited person. But that's not what this exact case I'm dealing with has to do with at all. There are no prohibited persons involved here. There were no missing background checks. There were no missing anything that would actually affect public safety.
In a case I'm aware of in my district, the error wasn't even made by the license holder. The error was made by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement because they were charged with a certain feature of the background check. And so if a license holder has to rely on a state entity to do some portion of the check and they make an error, that certainly shouldn't result in the license holder experiencing a revocation action, should it?
We agree, it should not.
And yet, that's the circumstance. And I'm wondering just how you hear that testimony, Mr. Cummins, as you deal with representing a family that's dealt with such loss at the hands of such a grave error. Does the hypocrisy not ring pretty loud?
Look, I've been on all sides of this. I've been a United States attorney. I prosecuted more gun crimes than probably many prosecutors in the country. It was the #1 priority in the Bush administration to prosecute crime, gun crime, not administrative gun crime, real gun crime, people that are out committing crimes with guns, and we prosecuted a whole bunch of them. I've also been a defense attorney, and I've been with families of people that are in prison. I've been to prisons and met with people. Anybody that thinks that the guns that are being sold in private sales are driving the level of crime we're seeing in our community, on the list of things that are driving the level of crime we see in our community, private gun sales is way down at the bottom. And there's a great number of other things that aren't being discussed here at all that have to be driving it more than.
I want you to be able to respond specifically to Ms. Sampson's testimony that guns make their way from the legal marketplace to the illegal marketplace. Because it seems to me, hearing that testimony, that then you wouldn't attack the people who are trying to legally engage in the legal transfer of firearms, right? You would go after the people engaging in the illegal conduct. But what's your reaction to that testimony?
I agree with that. I think gun crimes are committed by people, not guns, and we need to focus on the people that are committing the crimes, and we need to be asking ourselves, why is this person a criminal? What's their background? I know the answers to a lot of those questions because I've been living it for 35 years, but it doesn't really have much to do with where they acquired the firearm.
And everything we know about the law, for someone to be a criminal, they have to have the intent to commit a crime. They have to have the mens rea, right? And
Correct.
Do you worry as you look at some of the ways in which these laws are being weaponized against people, that we're getting away from someone actually wanting to commit a crime, and indeed people are experiencing this really harsh regulatory action when they want to be legally compliant?
I would suggest that the tactics that were used in the Malinowski search would be incompetent and reckless if it was a very serious crime. It's even much more offensive because this is not a serious crime that they suspected. It's probably the lowest level crime that would ever be drug into a United States Attorney's office.
So why did this happen? Is this just to send a message? Is this someone's incompetence? Do you wonder about that?
I wonder about it, and that's probably a question for this committee to answer, not me, but I'm certainly concerned about it, and it makes this tragedy even harder to take, to think that it might be politically motivated or for some other reason.
Thank you. I see I'm out of time. I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. I now recognize Ms. Plaskett for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. First, I want to say it's very interesting that we keep talking about the fact that there were no body cams on the ATF officers that were there to execute that warrant. What's very interesting, and I'd like to admit and submit into the record a letter that's been sent from ATF to Mr. Jim Jordan dated May 21st, 2024, from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Explosives.
Without objection.
Thank you. And in that letter, it reminds this Congress that in 2021, the department directed its law enforcement components, including ATF, to develop plans for a phased implementation of body-worn cameras. But the very thing that they're trying to do, which is to eliminate the ATF, is the reason that they don't have body cams, because they didn't give them the funding for it. Congress has specifically stated in its appropriations that they don't want to fund ATF. They don't want to give them the money to be able to operate. They don't want to give Mr. Klickner's clients sufficient ATF officers to be able to quickly do the kind of paperwork that they need. That's why they're taking so long. They don't want to give them the funding to be able to have body cams. And so ATF has only a third of its individuals who are wearing body cams. And I have specifically requested from Congress the funding so that everyone can wear those body cams. And my colleagues have denied that. They're the ones who have said they don't need that money. Let's get rid of ATF. They have legislation to abolish the ATF, the elimination of the ATF Act, abolish the ATF Act, and eliminate this woke, weaponized agency. Everything's woke when you don't like it. Eliminate it, and that way, these are the reasons. So they want to have it both ways. They want to say that they don't have body cams, and that's the reason they're doing, and we feel sorry for people who haven't had the body cams, but they're the reason they don't have them. Point it right back at yourself why those body cams weren't on them, and see if that continues to work for you. But we're also talking about another thing that was discussed, which I found very interesting, was that individuals who are doing this as hobbies. One of the reasons that we changed the rule to the engaged in business rule is because an individual who can have as his primary income a large income can then sell a lot of firearms and not be considered a firearms dealer because their primary income is more than the firearms income that they're doing, even if it's voluminous, the amount of firearm sales that they're making, if their primary income level is higher. And so, a couple of years ago in 2022, President Biden signed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which has, as was one of its rules, a rule with regard to no longer can an individual hide the fact that they are, by all accounts, by a common law person's accounts, an actual firearms dealer and not a hobbyist. And one of the ways I would look at determining if in fact a person is a hobbyist as opposed to a firearms dealer is, Ms. Sampson, in your opinion, is someone who buys and then almost immediately resells at least 150 firearms in a 3-year period a hobbyist or an unlicensed gun dealer?
If that is what a person was doing, then they would be more likely to be an unlicensed gun dealer.
Is it concerning to you if someone sells 150 firearms and conducts no background check on the individuals who are purchasing those firearms?
Yes, because ATF data shows that those unlicensed and unbackground check sales usually end up going to prohibited purchasers.
I'd like to submit for the record the actual search warrant, the unsealed application for a search warrant, and the affidavit and other information therein, which on page 28 states that as of February 27, 2024, approximately 6 firearms are known to have been recovered in the commission of crimes. Those are related to the firearms from that Mr. Malinowski purchased and then sold.
Mr. Chairman, could I?
No, I'm speaking. It's my time.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. And then, in your opinion, Ms. Sampson, would ATF be justified in being concerned when someone sells a firearm to an individual who has been convicted of robbery and is prohibited from owning a gun?
Yes, because selling to a prohibited purchaser is a violation of the law.
In your opinion, would ATF be justified in being concerned
Time, young lady.
when selling a firearm that lands in the hands of a 15-year-old member of the Nortina criminal street gang?
Yes.
Thank you. I yield back.
Young lady yields back. Mr. Cummins, I think Mr. Stubbe will give you a chance to respond.
Mr. Cummins, you wanted to respond to that?
I just wanted to quickly say,
Is this his time now?
Yes, it's his time.
the ranking member made a misstatement that's been repeated in the press, and I'd just like to correct it. That affidavit refers to approximately, I think it's 142, but call it 150 guns that Mr. Malinowski purchased over 4 years, which I can tell you, I could name a lot of people in Arkansas that have bought 150 firearms in 4 years. It only documents 6, I believe, sales of any firearms in that affidavit, not 150. It documents that he purchased 150 guns, but it only documents that he sold about 6.
Which you're allowed to do in America, right?
As far as I know.
Gentleman's recognized.
Yeah, I mean, this whole
case is outrageous to me. And Ms. Malinowski, I feel like we owe you an apology on behalf of the American government today, because ATF isn't going to give you that apology. So we'll do it today on behalf of our government, who just, I kind of uniquely situated. I have a military background, but my father's a retired sheriff, did 20 years on the SWAT team, executed countless search warrants. My brother's 10 years on the SWAT team, still on the force, executed countless search warrants. And, you know, you have conversations with them. I have a military background, so I kind of understand clearing a room and that sort of thing. And when they execute a search warrant, they would wait until the individual wasn't at their home where they knew that there was a firearm present to avoid a situation where one of their officers were injured. And your testimony is, and it's in the record, that they followed Mr. Malinowski. They knew where he worked. Mr. Gates made a very good point that he worked at an airport, a secure environment where it would have been very easy to go in and execute a search warrant. And if they were going to arrest him or question him, do that there where there were no weapons involved. It would have been peaceful. Did ATF ever serve him with an administrative cease and desist letter?
No, sir.
Did he have
Not to my knowledge.
Did he have any knowledge or understanding that he was being investigated for any type of crime?
Well, obviously, he's not available for me to ask that question to, but to the best of my knowledge and based on our investigation, the answer is no.
You and his wife,
Yes.
obviously.
Yes, sir.
Since Malinowski did not receive a cease and desist letter, did he ever get any other, well, I just asked that. In ATF search warrant application, agents indicate that they talked to him on February 8th, just over a month prior to the raid. The agents indicate that he attempted to elude them. Is there any indication that Mr. Malinowski was ever aware that the people following him were law enforcement officers?
No, that portion of the affidavit is comical.
Would you like to expand?
Maybe embarrassing. I mean, it's an irrelevant portion of the affidavit where they talk about traffic and him trying to follow him. It sounds like somebody that isn't a very good driver to me, and I'm familiar with the area that they're describing, and everybody is in jeopardy when they make that transition, but it has nothing to do with this case.
And again, it was like 6 o'clock in the morning, so he doesn't know he's being investigated. There's no like letter that's sent that you need to cease and desist of what you're doing, or we would like to have a conversation with you. It sits hard with me because I would react the exact same way. If somebody beat my door in at 6 o'clock in the morning, I can guarantee you myself and my wife would be approaching the door with a firearm. So it's not out, and you would think that the ATF agents would also conclude that that's a reasonable response to your door getting beaten in at 6 o'clock when you don't know you're being investigated. Does ATF typically have body cams? Does Little Rock Police Office Department typically have body cams?
Interestingly, according to my understanding, Little Rock Police does wear body cams, but they didn't have them on that morning, and so they were under the supervision of ATF, and you have to ask ATF why Little Rock didn't have theirs on.
But Little Rock typically does have body cams. And again, my experience with my family, they have body cams, and if they would have turned them off in the execution of a search warrant, that would be a very big problem for any law enforcement agent that is involved in an execution of a search warrant with no body cameras fulfilled.
That's one of the specific times they'd be required to have them on.
Did ATF ever have an opportunity to serve this search warrant at a time when it would have been less dangerous?
Probably 1,000 opportunities that we could sit here and say.
I've only got, I'm just outraged. I mean, Mr. Golden said that it was a no-knock. It was not a no-knock warrant. And you stated that there was like 47 seconds or something. So if they did knock at 6 o'clock in the morning, it's reasonable that the Malinowskis didn't hear that. Because you wouldn't be approaching, if somebody knocked on my door at 6 o'clock in the morning, I wouldn't assume that it's a bad guy because they wouldn't knock. But if you hear a door beaten in at 6 o'clock in the morning, there was such a short period of time between the door getting kicked in and knocked in, and then Mr. Malinowski being shot, that it's reasonable to believe that they didn't hear the knock if there was a knock, which I'm looking forward to the Judiciary Committee asking all these questions. I hope that the chairman's going to ask for, and I know they have asked for every officer that was present that day, because I would love for this committee with the oversight authority that we have over the ATF to depose every single one of those officers that were present that day and get a sworn deposition from every single one of those people. And again, Mrs. Malinowski, I'm sorry for your loss and the loss of your family to a clear abuse of the rule of law, in my opinion. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to express my condolences to Mrs. Malinowski. I'm terribly sorry for your loss and for what you had to endure that day. I do want to get into some of the details because I think they're very important. It was actually, you know, the search warrant affidavit, without going into great detail, demonstrates that Mr. Malinowski did purchase 142 guns from 2019 to February 27, 2024. He resold at least 9, because we have the 6 plus the 3 to the undercover firearm. He also had, at various times, at various gun shows, 12 or 13 firearms on the table to be sold, and he offered one witness, who was the one convicted of robbery and therefore was a prohibited person, many more firearms than what he purchased. Many of these firearms were purchased just days before they were sold. So whether or not you want to assert, Mr. Cummins, that this was a hobby of his, you agree that there's certainly probable cause to believe that he was selling guns to individuals without a license and without performing a background check because he didn't have a license.
There's no allegation that he knowingly sold a gun to anyone that was prohibited. And,
That's not what probable cause.
And under ATF's interpretation of
But you don't have to. You don't have to do that. I just said that he.
Well, I'm just answering your
selling
question.
without a license. Like, there's certainly probable cause that he was in the business of selling without a license.
Under ATF's interpretation of a vague regulation.
But not yours. So you would say that if you purchase 142 firearms within a 4-year span as a former U.S. attorney, and you have evidence of 9 sales within that period of time, plus many other more weapons offered for sale, you would say, as you, not the ATF, as you, as the former U.S. attorney, that there is no probable cause to believe that this person is in the business of selling guns without a license?
I would agree that that could be probable cause.
Thank you. So we have probable cause. The Little Rock Police is there with the ATF. They go in, and the one fact that doesn't ever seem to be mentioned here, and that the chairman's letter does not mention, is that an ATF agent was shot.
That's correct.
Is that correct, Mr. Cummins?
That's correct.
Okay. So an ATF agent was shot and then in response fired back at Mr. Malinowski. Is that accurate?
That is accurate, and it's also a tragedy.
It is a tragedy. I agree. I agree. And you also agree, I assume. I was a assistant U.S. attorney for 10 years, secured many search warrants, oversaw the execution of them, and arrest warrants. They're routinely done at 6 a.m. Is that right?
Yeah, a lot of warrants are executed at 6 a.m. Whether I agree with that as a tactic is another discussion, but yes, that's not uncommon.
No, okay, I want to understand that we're making a big deal out of the 6 a.m. here, but that is the standard time that law enforcement executes arrest warrants and executes search warrants. So I certainly am sorry that this is a tragedy that Mr. Malinowski died. I'm also sorry that Mr. Malinowski shot an ATF agent during a search. And I think if he were truly not in the business of selling firearms, the way to respond to a search warrant is to allow your house to be searched and to cooperate. But it is insane to me that we are sitting here criticizing the ATF because they retaliated with deadly force after someone shot an agent. That is what happened here. This was not an out-of-the-ordinary execution of a search warrant. This is standard operating procedure. Mr. Cummins acknowledges that there was probable cause to do it. And now there is an investigation of this incident. Is that right, Mr. Cummins?
There has been an investigation that's been handed over to the local prosecutor.
So the local prosecutor is investigating it, and you know as a prosecutor that none of the witnesses or the relevant people involved are allowed to discuss this publicly while an investigation is going on, correct?
I don't know what the policy of ATF is on that.
Well, was it your policy as a prosecutor? It certainly was mine. Witnesses do not talk to the public while there's an investigation going off. One last question. As a U.S. attorney, did you ever send a notification to a target of yours who's buying 140 guns, selling at least 9 of them, that, hey, you're under investigation, just a heads up?
I hope I would have, yes.
You would have? You would have reached out and said, hey, by the way, I'm
Question
investigating.
was asking, the question
so you
asked
can
and
go
answered.
ahead and destroy and
His
hide all
answer.
the evidence? You would have done that? You notified the targets that you
Time
were
of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from North
yield
Carolina
back.
yields back. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Cummins, with some economy of time, do you wish to respond to the last barrage?
Well, only to say that nobody disputes that when a law enforcement is fired upon, that they have a right to fire back. The point is that everything that created that situation was incompetent, unnecessary, and reckless. And it defied the law because, as a former assistant, you know the Fourth Amendment cases that allow either a no-knock or what I would call a tap-and-go type entry with no real waiting for someone to come to the door are only justified by exigent circumstances that do not exist in this case. So in my opinion, as a former U.S. attorney, this was a completely illegal search because of the forced entry and the lack of time they gave the occupants of a fairly large home to get up at 6 in the morning. The law requires them to wait for enough time, for a reasonable amount of time for someone to come to the door and admit them in.
And 50
this
seconds.
is
I
not
assume
a
the
reasonable
local prosecutor
Wait, wait, wait,
Time
wait,
belongs
wait,
to John
my time. You've had plenty. And Mr. Cummins,
Actually, I had 5
I
minutes.
appreciate that very effective rebuttal. Here's what's interesting to me as this hearing evolves. I hear Mr. Goldman defending the practice that he says is engaged in every day. And earlier on, the ranking member invoked the Breonna Taylor episode, and I've just been sitting here reviewing it. Mr. Goldman said earlier on, well, this wasn't a no-knock warrant. Okay, what's the difference in the situation if they knock and they blow in, in 20 seconds, or it's a no-knock? In fact, in the Breonna Taylor case, that wasn't a no-knock warrant. They said they knocked and waited 45 seconds, and they went in. Here's something that's interesting. In the Breonna Taylor thing, she was killed on March 13, 2020. In that, it was execution of a search warrant, just like this one.
Murder.
Time belongs
The
to the gentleman.
first police officer was fired June 20. In September 2020, Louisville entered into a $12 million settlement with the family. Have you been made any overtures by the Department of Justice to settle liability against the government on behalf of Mr. Malinowski's family?
No, sir.
In September, also, one of the police officers was indicted for willful endangerment or wanton endangerment. A second officer was fired in January 2021. A third officer was retired in April 2021. Oh, I left out. In October 2020, grand jury testimony was leaked. Later in 2021, the DOJ indicted 4 officers, and even now it's retrying one who were for the hung jury. I don't understand the difference. I don't understand my colleagues' reaction that.
If you would yield, I could share the difference with you.
You've talked for a long time. I'm going to talk during my time.
Okay, then I would tell you the difference.
Maybe you can provide context for your egregious double standard. No one that I recall on the Republican side, when the Breonna, by the way, you said this was interfering in the process to have this hearing. The first time Congress had a hearing was in June 2020 over the Breonna Taylor episode. There was no concern about interfering. The concern was about the use of this kind of tactic to enter unnecessarily and jeopardize people's lives. Yep. Now suddenly that seems to be of no concern whatsoever. Can you account for that difference, Mr. Cummins?
The facts are very similar, although that was a drug investigation, and under the case law, they are allowed to go in faster because of the potential for destruction of evidence.
Yes, so in this case, we're talking about conduct that the law would say is malum prohibitum, not malum in se. In other words, what the reason they entered this residence and jeopardized this entire family, including Ms. Malinowski, who has no allegations against her, and shot this man dead is because he didn't have the proper license for the business they say he was engaged in. And it's even disputed about whether he was engaged in that business.
Correct.
And in that case, Ms. Breonna Taylor's boyfriend was without any contradiction engaging in illicit drug activity and receiving and deal. He was a drug dealer, and he was carrying it on in her place of residence. I can't account for the gross disparity, except that Americans hear a lot, and I hear a lot back about concern about a double standard of justice. Is there a double standard of justice here, Mr. Cummins, in those two episodes?
There appears to be, and that causes a loss of trust in government and in these agencies.
Mr. Kleckner, the only place I see reaction, besides a hearing like this exposing stuff, is that attorneys general across the nation have sued over the two rules, the business engaging in the business rule that's at issue here, I guess, really, and the pistol brace rule. Why is that the only recourse that people have state attorneys general file litigation?
I don't understand your question, Congressman. Are you saying that they should be?
My time's expired anyway. We're going to get a new one. I'm running out.
Well, we can give you a chance to, you want to rephrase the
Yeah,
question?
thank you, Mr. Chairman, if I can rephrase the question. Here's what I'm saying. Congress doesn't seem to be able to do anything to press back against this overreach. At least it hasn't, including under Republican leadership. The only thing that seems to be available to people for the government to do to provide recourse is I see a state attorneys general out filing lawsuits in great numbers, 21 states in one case, 24. Is that the only recourse that people can expect from their government in the response to these kinds of abuses?
It apparently is the only one they have, but it's not what they should expect. We should expect that the administrative agency is reined in a little bit here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We're trying. The chair recognizes gentlelady from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and the vigorous back and forth regarding Breonna Taylor. First of all, I do appreciate you being here and your answering of the questions. You know, I do want to make sure that before we go down this road, I clarify some things that were different in the Breonna Taylor case. Number one, the officers were considered to have botched what took place on that day because they fired blindly into a home, meaning that they initiated some sort of deadly force, and the only information that they had was allegedly that this was the place of some sort of drug activity. At that point in time, you ended up having her boyfriend, who returned fire, believing that someone was breaking in. It is very different when you are returning fire versus initiating fire, and there was no need to do so. In addition to that, no-knock warrants and knock warrants are basically a couple of seconds of difference, if I'm going to be honest. But one of the things that I worked on in the state legislature was actually making sure that we could reform no-knock warrants because it is a risk not only to the people in the homes, especially in a state like Texas, where everyone is allowed to have a gun, but it's also a huge risk to law enforcement. So being able to do this effectively, this is dangerous work that law enforcement engage in every single day. And I do want to be clear that I am always sorry for the loss of life. I don't care about the race. I don't care about any of those things. And honestly, I believe in the criminal justice system. I believe that if someone is accused of something, they should have their day in court. So I do want to say that I take issue with anyone losing their life, period, even if it's somebody that's accused of a crime. And I believe that they should go through due process and have an opportunity. But in this particular set of circumstances, we know that if somebody shoots at me, in fact, some would argue that last week I had a colleague that decided she wanted to shoot at me, I'm going to shoot back. And that's what happened here. But what's more frustrating for me in this hearing, and what seems to be a pattern, is that we continue to attempt to litigate pending cases. We saw that we had one of the witnesses in the Trump trial. He came and testified before us last week, and then he went and testified this week in front of the judiciary. And then we know that this is still a pending case, and I do want to afford an opportunity for those that will be granted access to discovery, video, whatever video doesn't exist, as well as any statements, depositions, all those things. Some folk that have access to all the information, and ultimately, if this needs to go to court, having a jury that will make a decision based upon the facts and the evidence. So with that, I want to make sure that we move on to something else, which is the reality that, in fact, let me do this before I run out of time. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record 97% annual gun owner October 2023 report, which details these and other statistics pertaining to gun owners' views on common sense gun control policies, and I'm gonna go back up to what those views are. Thank you so much. 97%, a bipartisan group of gun owners and non-gun owners, which conducts research on gun safety policies, found that with regard to common sense gun policies, 86% of gun owners, well over the simple majority, support keeping guns out of the hands of violent criminals. 70% of gun owners said they wish we would enact some kind of gun reform. 66% of gun owners, for instance, think guns should be restricted on school grounds, and 67% think that they should be restricted in government buildings. And I will tell you that I fall into those categories because I am a licensed gun owner. Yet despite the majority of Americans and the majority of gun owners, Republicans last week passed a bill out of the House that eliminates states' ability to regulate firearms on private property, government buildings, playgrounds, and gun-free school zones. If that's not hypocrisy, I honestly don't know what it is, and it doesn't end there. As the party self-proclaiming itself as law enforcement's biggest advocate and supporter, Republicans on this very committee have introduced legislation to abolish the law enforcement agency entirely. Ms. Sampson, I have a few yes or no questions. I may only get to one. Yes or no, are you familiar with the role of ATF?
Yes.
And to your understanding, the ATF is in fact law enforcement, correct?
Yes.
Does ATF's duties include preventing incidents, investigating cases, and recommending prosecution for issues of violent crimes and weapons for gangs and career criminals?
Yes.
Narcotic traffickers?
Yes.
Domestic and international arms traffickers?
Yes.
Armed human traffickers?
Yes.
Terrorists?
Yes.
And with that, I will yield.
Yeah. Brian Malinowski was none of those. The gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am, first and foremost, very, very sorry, Ms. Malinowski. As the wife of a SWAT medic from one wife to another, I am deeply apologetic, and I can't even begin to understand the pain and suffering that you and your family are going through. My husband, as I said, who is a SWAT medic, when we heard about this case, he was so thoroughly disgusted and heartbroken. That is truly, I believe, not a reflection on the good men and women in law enforcement that intend to do their jobs the best they can, and we are so very sorry. Mr. Chairman, I am also deeply disappointed that the discussion today has been centered around ways to restrict constitutional rights to law-abiding citizens instead of the mental health crisis that we face in this country, which is a massive driver of crime in this country. Also, very little has been talked about when we're discussing the overgrown, overly aggressive, and woefully inadequate administrative state. And so with that, I'm gonna jump right into Mr. Kleckner. Thank you for returning back to Congress to provide testimony. And in a March 10th, 2023 Judiciary Subcommittee on the administrative state, you addressed the ATF stabilizing rule, brace rule. In your testimony, you said, quote, "This rule effectively gives the ATF the power to determine who is a felon by the stroke of a bureaucrat's pen. This is not an appropriate enforcement of law. It is tyranny," end quote. And I agree with you. What is sad is that in this rule, we are seeing a microcosm of what is happening at other federal agencies. The American people are under assault by the Biden administration's regulatory regime from all corners of the federal government. That is why I introduced the REINS Act. As many of you know, the bill would address regulatory overreach by requiring every new major rule proposed by federal agencies be approved by Congress before going into effect. This is the reassertion of Article I authority that is how the Founding Fathers intended, not unelected, nameless, faceless bureaucrats arbitrarily dictating law. After all, We know that Americans pay $2 trillion a year in additional compliance costs, economic loss for this aggressive regulatory regime. The stabilizing brace rule and ATF zero tolerance policy are prime examples of regulations that not only impose compliance costs on firearm retailers, but infringe on Americans' basic Second Amendment rights. So I'm going to go down the line, and I'm going to come right back to you. Mr. Cummins, yes or no, should federal agencies be able to shift criminal statutes and rewrite law?
No.
Thank you. Ms. Sampson.
That's not what happened here. They're enforcing a
I did not ask that.
congressional
I
rule.
asked for a yes or no. Should federal agencies be arbitrarily able to write law?
No, and that's not what happened
Okay,
here.
thank you. Mr. Graham?
No, Congresswoman.
Mr. Kleckner?
No.
Thank you. Mr. Kleckner, my understanding is that this rule disregards ATF's own approval of stabilizing braces in 2012, correct?
This current zero tolerance policy rule? I'm not sure what you're asking.
Regarding how they classified the pistol braces as an accessory, therefore not subject to full ATF regulatory standards.
Right.
So in the time since they approved them in 2012 to today, ATF has done a full 180 on the issue and has chosen to impose erroneous regulations on firearm accessories that were originally intended for disabled veterans, correct?
That's true, and upon which people relied upon their opinion when they were acting, and they're now in trouble for.
Absolutely. And the owners of these firearms would now be committing a felony if they did not register, surrender, or destroy the accessory.
Correct, which means their right to even possess a firearm for the rest of their life is now gone.
Exactly. Did Congress ever approve this legislatively?
No, ma'am.
Can you quickly outline the specific penalties for failing to register a pistol brace under this rule?
Quickly, yes, felony.
Financial as well?
Oh, for sure. Defending yourself, financial costs, losing the right to protect yourself or have firearms in the future, all those things.
Right. And so now that this rule is being litigated in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, considering the rule has criminal implications, can you speak to the risks associated with circumventing the legislative process in this case?
The risks now going forward, or even companies don't know what they're supposed to do because it changes back and forth so many times. I think people are afraid, as someone said earlier, about what they're supposed to do, what they're going to get in trouble with, whose guidance they're supposed to follow. It's all unclear.
I appreciate that, and I know my time is expiring. I have a list of questions for you, Mr. Graham, that I will submit for the record, but I think it is clear that what we are seeing today, particularly under the ATF, is a gross overreach, a weaponization of the federal government in its true form. It's something that I think Republicans, Democrats, and all Americans should be equally concerned about. With that, I yield.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from Wyoming is recognized.
I'm going to continue with that same line of questioning. Mr. Kleckner, this subcommittee's last hearing, in fact, was on the Biden administration's use of lawfare against political opponents, and we've seen that play out in a variety of ways, including in the case that's been ongoing in New York City, as well as what's been happening in Georgia and Florida, et cetera. But each and every ATF rule subjects more Americans to legal compliance, which, if ignored, even unknowingly imposes criminal and monetary penalties, as well as additional fees and legal costs. Mr. Kleckner, do you think that the rulemaking agenda is an attempt to employ lawfare against Americans who stand for the Second Amendment?
I do.
Okay, and if so, what does that say about where we stand when the Biden administration considers its citizens who believe in and adhere to the Constitution as its political enemies?
That is scary if that's their motivation, and it's very difficult to comply with, for sure.
In December 2023, the ATF Little Rock Field Office received a case referral for Mr. Malinowski. In the same month, it opened its investigation and spent the next several months surveilling his activities, including tailing him and placing trackers on his car. I find this absolutely frightening that we have agencies who are willing to go to this extent with a law-abiding citizen. The ATF knew his movements, his schedule, where he was and when he was there, and therefore the ATF knew when he was home and when he wasn't, meaning that the ATF decided to execute the search warrant when he was home, even though they knew that he would have firearms in the home. And in fact, Mr. Cummings, you have uncovered the fact that the ATF team members gathered to execute the search warrant the week before the raid, but then changed their plan when they learned that Mr. Malinowski would not be home. In other words, they wanted him there and they wanted him there bad. Mr. Graham, is this standard operating procedure for the ATF to ensure that the target is there when they would execute this kind of a search warrant? Or can they do it without the target being in the home?
Madam Congresswoman, unfortunately, I have no firsthand knowledge of the warrant process and or how they are executed. So
Well, Mr. Cummins, what about you? Do you think that that would be standard operating procedure to wait until the gentleman was there at 1 o'clock in the morning knowing that he had guns versus just going ahead and executing the search warrant when he wasn't there?
Well, clearly, it's a search warrant. He didn't need to be there. I think they definitely wanted him there, and I think that this does happen in federal law enforcement quite a bit. They want the target there because they want to surprise them, and this is part of the reason they go at 6 in the morning. They want to surprise them. They want them in their night clothes. They want their hair stand up. They want them scared, angry, shocked, and then they want to violate their Fifth Amendment right to not incriminate themselves before they remember they have a Sixth Amendment right to call their lawyer. So it's kind of it's the trifecta. They want to violate 3 constitutional rights, the 4th, 5th, and 6th, all in one scoop, and in this case, it didn't work out for them.
Well, and it seems to me that the overarching issue here is that the government should have standards in place to ensure the safety of all citizens in the conduct of its investigations and actions, even when criminal activity is suspected. In the case of execution of a search warrant for Mr. Malinowski, the ATF appears to have deviated from this premise and standards which are in place and in fact ended up executing Mr. Malinowski himself.
That's exactly right.
The Constitution secures our rights by placing limits on the federal government's power. Even when an American citizen is suspected of being engaged in unlawful behavior, as you just indicated, the Fourth Amendment secures citizens against unreasonable search and seizure. The Fifth Amendment ensures due process. The Sixth Amendment guarantees has certain rights for criminal defendants, and the Eighth Amendment protects us against cruel and unusual punishment. Mr. Cummins, is it fair to say that a responsible execution of a search warrant is one of the primary mechanisms that we have in place to guarantee an American's rights in criminal proceedings?
I can't imagine what the British were doing to people that would be worse than what happened to Brian Malinowski on March 19th that would have brought about the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution.
Mr. Graham, do you have any recommendations of how to address the situation we're describing today to ensure that this does not happen again? What kind of reforms should Congress take up to make sure that we can protect Mr. Malinowski and other people like him?
Madam Congresswoman, once again, having limited exposure to the warrant process and or the execution, I would defer to Congress creating whatever laws, regulations they deem appropriate to be delegated to the appropriate enforcement agency.
Mr. Kleckner, what about you? What recommendations would you have?
I agree with Mr. Graham. I think Congress's oversight here is really important. I think what you asked me earlier about the administrative overreach is these administrative agencies specifically going against what Congress has put into place, like the Gun Control Act or like the willfulness requirement.
Between the bump stocks and the pistol braces and those things, what we have are agencies who are intentionally adopting vague rules and regulations in order to criminalize lawful and constitutional conduct. It needs to end. I appreciate you all being here. I am sorry for your loss as well, Ms. Malinowski. We have to expose these types of activities so that we can prevent them from happening in the future. With that, I yield back.
Generally yields back. I would just let the witnesses know we have just a few more minutes. Mr. Davidson, I don't know if Mr. Fry will be able to join us, and then a couple comments or minutes with Ms. Plaskett, the ranking member, myself, and then we'll be done. So if you need a break, obviously let us know, but we should be done here in the next 15 minutes is sort of the goal. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
I thank the chairman, thank our witnesses, and Mrs. Malinowski, please accept my sincere apologies and deepest sympathies. This is something that was avoidable, and I'm encouraged, frankly, because I hear colleagues that were once highly concerned about warrant practices and held hearings when they were in the majority about criminal justice reform may actually be willing to do it instead of politicize it. I felt, as a guy who was not part of the Judiciary Committee, I'm on Financial Services and Foreign Affairs, and only on this because we have seen abuses of the Fourth Amendment that creep into your financial privacy. We've seen weaponized government go after every kind of nook and cranny they can for what have historically been viewed as law-abiding citizens. The restraints against general warrants. So John Adams said general warrants I swept up whoever might have been present in the square on certain days. These kinds of things that went on are part of what led to the revolution. So it was an abuse of privacy. But if you look at it, part of the concern for warrants is that they don't take the least risky means possible, which does expose officers to risks, but it exposes not just people that maybe you do have probable cause to suspect a crime, but it exposes their family members and others to unnecessary risk. And maybe there is a way that we should look at the intent of the Fourth Amendment, that it would minimize the risk here. It seems that there was a much less invasive way to solve the crime that was alleged here. And you would think that because of the Biden administration's focus on this crime, that this was the big crime wave that's sweeping the country. That apparently the only reason we have guns on the street are because people like Mr. Malinowski. That, but for Mr. Malinowski and people like that, the streets would be safe in Washington, D.C. People wouldn't be getting carjacked and robbed at gunpoint. Chicago wouldn't see massive waves of murders. It's pistol braces. It must be the pistol braces because they're going after the pistol braces. I mean, there is no basis in terms of the crime that the Biden administration is going after. And I think that's why the public is so concerned. You're targeting people in part, I think, because of political ideology. President Biden's recent executive order concerning firearms dealers was described by the White House themselves as getting, quote, as close to universal background checks as possible without additional legislation, end quote. I do not recall Congress voting on universal background checks. On the contrary, this is a bureaucrat at an agency passing pseudo-laws, fake laws, and they're using them to effectively force defendants to spend their treasure defending against a crime that hasn't even become crime in the normal way by law. So, Mr. Kleckner, what steps can be taken to defund and defeat these fake laws originating at the ATF in particular?
I think Congress needs to hold them accountable.
And to point that out, one of the main ways we do that is with appropriations. Yep. So it's not just whether they're funded, but what can they do with the funds? And part of that is timely. We're going back into appropriations, having passed on holding accountable the agency this time. I think hopefully we'll find the resolve to do that this time in the next path. Mr. Cummins, look, I just wanted to close out with you because you're highlighting an important case. You've had a background where you are familiar with the warrant process. And I think not just here in this case, you pointed out, look, it is a practice. Is it a good practice to knock at 6 a.m. and come in? And, you would think that, El Chapo, maybe, no-knock warrants. There's a time and a place. But how do they weigh the right time and place for those kind of tactics versus, maybe less intrusive, less risky tactics?
Well, we've given great deference to law enforcement to choose their tactics, and we are concerned about law enforcement officer safety. And so that's a good reason to do that. But I do believe we've over-militarized our law enforcement. I have great concerns about that. I think we do this way too often, and we need to take a hard look at it. In this particular case, I don't think they did it lawfully at all, and there's zero justification. But even that said, law enforcement does this kind of thing quite a bit.
You point out that there's surveillance for a while, and there wasn't like an exigent circumstance. There wasn't evidence that was going to be flushed down the toilet or disposed of. There was evidence that would be physically present on site, and there were lots of periods of time where Mr. Malinowski was in a place where he could have been detained and questioned, could have been brought to the residence, or could have been caught as he's walking into or about to walk out of a home. So there were lots of less invasive means, and I just hope that we can find a way in statute or in practice to be able to say, let's do it that way more often, and let's not violate the civil liberties of our citizens. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The ranking member is recognized for closing comments or questions.
Just want to thank the witnesses for being here. Mrs. Malinowski, I see the pain that you are still in, and I pray that there's resolution for you and your family. And I thank you that I see that you have a support system with you. Thank you to those who are there with you, providing that support to you in this time. I have nothing at this time further. I would, however, request, introduce for the record the 2 Demand 2 letters sent to Point Blank Firearms. Being on the Demand 2 letter program for 2 years in a row means that a business sold 25 or more firearms in a business year that were connected to a crime.
Without objection.
Thank you. And then I would also remind my colleagues about that appropriations process, that removing funding from ATF, individuals on this committee who pass or want to have laws passed, such as the elimination of ATF and the abolition of ATF, is not the way to support regulating guns in this country, that we need to do this comprehensively. A step in the right direction was the bipartisan gun legislation that was passed in 2022. There's more work to be done, and with that, I yield back.
Mr. Cummings, when government changes the rules without a vote of Congress, is that the weaponization of government? When you have these agencies unilaterally change the law without a vote of the legislative body, is that would you call that a weaponization of government?
Seems that way to me.
Mr. Kleckner, would you agree?
I do.
Mr. Graham?
Chairman, that's a department doing what they're directed to do, sir.
Okay. Let me say this. When the ATF unilaterally changed the definition of what a pistol brace and how that worked, and overnight made law-abiding citizens then felons, either had to turn the gun in or you're a felon, is that the weaponization of government, Mr. Kleckner?
It sure is, especially when we don't know that every American that had one of those got the message.
Exactly. And the same thing seems to have happened in the case of Mr. Malinowski. The ATF decided to change the definition of what an FFL, what a licensee was from principal livelihood to someone who's earning a profit. But it's even worse because they didn't have the definition changed and enacted when this terrible incident happened with Mr. Malinowski. That to me is that is the weaponization of government. Unilaterally making changes without it going through the legislative branch of government, the way our system is supposed to work, the checks and balances, how they're supposed to work. And in the case we're talking about so much today, they hadn't even fully made that change. They didn't even follow their own rule, for goodness sake. And we have an American who's no longer with us because of that. Mr. Cummings, response?
I agree with everything you said.
Let me ask you one other question. So Little Rock police were involved in the raid on the Malinowski home?
We know they were present. We don't know exactly what their role was. There were 10 carloads of agents.
No, we've seen the video of all the carloads coming from the Walmart parking lot to the Malinowski neighborhood. We've seen that video. Were the Little Rock police officers wearing body cams on the morning of this raid on the Malinowski home?
According to what we've been told, nobody had body cams on, even though Little Rock police are equipped with body cams.
That was my next question. They're supposed to wear them. Little Rock police.
That's my understanding. I'm not 100% sure about that.
Do you believe that the ATF told Little Rock police officers not to have their body cams on or not to have them engaged?
When the local PD is supporting a federal agency, typically they're taking orders from the federal agency. So I would presume, I don't know, that ATF instructed them to not wear it.
But that would be a logical presumption as a guy who's a former U.S. attorney, the way it works, federal law enforcement working.
That's consistent with my understanding of how those relationships work.
And again, we're back to the question you asked in your opening statement a couple hours ago. Why? Why would ATF tell Little Rock, don't follow your own rules? We're not going to follow our rules. We don't want you following your rules. We don't want any video footage of what we're about to do at the Malinowski home. An upstanding citizen, by all accounts, your whole testimony, highest paid official in Little Rock municipal government. Why would they do that?
We have no idea.
Yeah, but we got to find the answer to that because this is this is the weaponization of government if I've ever seen it. We thank you all for being here today, for your testimony. And I got to say something official here before we close out our hearing. That concludes today's hearing. We thank our witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.